to another installment in the Non-Degree Credentials Research Network's webinar series. Today, we're really thrilled to have a new speaker today, Laura Ulrich from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, although I understand she's actually based in Charlotte, an economist there who oversees the SCCO. That's the Survey of Community College Outcomes that many of us have been interested in learning. A survey that covers a lot of topics related to community colleges. And as we all know, community colleges are one of the major sources of non-degree credentials, which are, of course, have always been of interest to us here at the NCRN. So Laura, we're really excited to learn more and some of the findings from the 2024 survey. So we're really looking forward to this presentation. You can present for, well, I mean, traditionally we do, 30, 40 minutes, but take as long as you need, and then we'll do a little moderated Q&A once you get through your slides.
Right. Thanks for welcoming me as the substitute presenter. Stephanie Norris, that was going to present today, has pneumonia. So unfortunately, she is not feeling very well and sounds worse than she feels. So you get me today, but I'll go ahead and share my slides and we'll jump right in. So I'll start out by saying that this project is a work in progress. We've been working on it for several years, but we continue to build out our project, especially in the non-credit space. And I'll kind of talk about that as we go through here, because as you can imagine, collecting data in this space is quite challenging in certain ways, but we still feel really committed to doing it. And so I'll talk about what we've done so far. I will talk a tiny bit about what we've done on the credit side and then what we're trying to do on the non-credit side and kind of where we're going from now. From here, so because I work at the Fed, I always get to remind you, though, that the views that I'm going to express are mine and not the official view of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. All right, so let's jump in. I always just remind people that the Federal Reserve cares about this because of our dual mandate, the maximum employment side of our mandate. Obviously, higher ed, education in general, heavily influences this side of our mandate. And so we are really interested in the pathways from K through 12 education to the workforce and how these pipelines work, right? Like how people are making decisions along this pipeline on how much education to consume, and then how that leads them to the workforce. We are also interested in the fact that this pipeline is leaky, right? There are people that consume certain credentials or choose not to consume a credential, right? Or even drop out of high school that don't end up in the labor force. And, very well documented that in general, on average, the more education someone consumes, the more likely they are to be in the labor force and the higher wage they receive. But one of the things that we really identified when we started doing more community college work, which was about 5 years ago that we really started digging in to learn more, one of the things that really stood out to us was that many of the policies that were designed in higher education were really designed for the right-hand side of this pipeline, and that was true for data collection as well at the federal level. So things really, a lot of state policies, a lot of state funding is better suited and better designed for four-year institutions than for the community colleges. And so we were learning as we went through this process about how kind of this misaligned incentives of institutions, students, and employers. And so that's what we are interested in, is learning more about kind of the how to align those incentives better. And part of our work in that is our data collection, but we're doing other things in addition to that we can talk about later. This work was really born out of just the federal government data that shows that graduation rates of community colleges are far below those of public four-year institutions. These are the institutions in the 5th district. So the 5th district covers the Carolinas, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and DC. And we have 121 public community colleges and 63 four-year institutions, and the four-year institutions have much higher graduation rates than the community colleges. As we talked to community colleges about this, they were very eager to tell us about how they didn't want us to use this data. They didn't like this data, basically don't look at it. It's not counting everyone we're serving. But, I always remind them that as an economist, I'm thinking about how people, institutions, governments, legislators, companies, how they're making decisions. And the reality is that these data are being used. We have found now at this point probably hundreds of ways in which the iPad's data are being used by different stakeholders. And so it wasn't kind of good enough in our mind just to say, hey, we need to ignore it. We thought like maybe there's a way we can come in and look at what colleges, how these colleges are serving their students differently. And so we are really clear from the beginning what we are and what we are not. And actually this slide kind of got messed up. It should say what we are and what we are not on the other side. I'll fix that. What we are is we are an independent research organization. We have expertise in the development of surveys, but also the collection and analysis of data. We have economists like myself, research analysts, but also survey directors and things like that. We're also deeply connected to our communities, our community development efforts. If you're not aware of what the federal government, for what the Federal Reserve does in that space, we're heavily ingrained into the communities where we work through our community development and CRA work. The economists also, the outreach economists also spend a lot of time on the ground. And so we're deeply connected with the community colleges in our district. We also, our lens is workforce employment, and the research that we're doing is contributed to the public good. So we are not, that's what it should say on the top. I need to really watch this slide because it says at the bottom and it's harder to see. We are not partisan or political. We are not government employees. We don't work for the federal government. We work for the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. So we have that independence. We're also not advocates, we're not advocating for community colleges. We're trying to provide data that stakeholders can use for decision-making purposes. And in some cases, in most cases, actually, our data, the success rates for community colleges are higher than what the federal government puts out, but that is not universally true. There are some schools that do not look as good in our metric as the IPEDS graduation rate. That's mostly because of how they're serving part-time students. But we're not funders. We can't issue a grant or anything like that. We won't be charging for our data or research on the way in or the way out. So, as I have in this box here, our goal is to provide data-driven insights to help institutions, policymakers, families, like help people make well-informed decisions about where they should spend their resources. So when we talk about resources, not just money, but also time and talent and capital as well. So let me just say for a second that when we started talking to these community colleges about the possibility that we might start collecting some data, our question to them right from the start was twofold. What data do you have that you are not submitting up to a national or federal organization? And then also, what data do you have that you're not really using at all that you think could help tell your story better? And so we ended up deciding to collect data in 4 different buckets. So we collect credit data, and we do use that to create our Richmond Fed success rate, which I'll talk about really briefly before I talk about non-credit. We also did decide to collect data on non-credits students. I'll talk about that in a minute. We collect more detailed data on dual enrollment than the federal government currently collects. You might be aware IPEDS just started producing some data on dual enrollment, but it's still very limited. And in fact, dual enrollment students, because you have to have a high school degree or GED before you get a community college award to count in the graduation rate, most of those students, even that are getting degrees, are not really counted. And then the last is we decided to collect data on wraparound services. So that's just kind of, we're hoping to create kind of a national database there on wraparound services that are offered at different schools. Interestingly, many of the states don't even know what their schools are doing in terms of wraparound services, because those are typically grant funded, or they're kind of scrapping together extra operating funds to use for that purpose. So there's generally no reporting mechanism there. So our Richmond Fed success rate, basically what we do is we take the graduation rate and we blow open the denominator and the numerator. So the numerator or the denominator for IPEDS is just, a full-time first-time cohort that's beginning in the fall semester. This is not really appropriate for community colleges for a whole host of reasons, right? Most of their students typically are part-time. They have more of a continuous enrollment cycle. So fall semester enrollment doesn't really mean as much at a community college as it does most four-year institutions, and many of them are not first-time students. So in our cohort, we include part-time students, which let me pause and say there, by including part-time students, we are lowering student success overall, because part-time students tend to have lower success rates. In our survey, they almost universally have lower success rates than full-time students at the school level. And then we're also counting first time and everybody who's first time at that institution. So if somebody started out at, UNC Greensboro, which is a 4-year school, and then transferred to Haywood Community College, we would count them in the Haywood cohort. But if they've been to Haywood 4 times, we would not count them. It has to be their first time at that institution. And then in terms of what we're deeming a success, we are including students are identified as success if they earn a degree, a diploma, or an industry recognized certificate or credential or licensure. That can be a non-credit credential. So these are credit students, but it might be, for example, that somebody that is going to get an associate's degree in automotive technology gets a non-credit credential in some sort of mechanic technology. We would count that as a success if they had done that. Those are very hard for us to observe because of data collection issues that cross credit and non-credit, but also because of third-party licensure rules. But we're still collecting it because we believe it'll get better over time, and we also don't want to take away the incentive to try to get that data. So we are able to observe it for some schools. Then we count students who transferred prior to receiving an award, and then students who persisted in good standing. For us, we're measuring this 4 years after student entry, and so persisted in good standing for these 30 credit hours. So they are at least kind of halfway done towards a associate degree, and they remain in good standing at the college. And we did that because we didn't want to go past a 4-year window to look at success, because we wanted it to be as timely as possible. But we also recognize that by including part-time students, we need to, provide ample opportunity for these students to finish. And research shows, like, if you've persisted for that long and are good standing, you're more likely to complete. So we started, I'll show you some of that data in just a second, but just to give you a little bit of a timeline, like I said, this really started about 4 or 5 years ago with us having a lot of conversations and then deciding, hey, maybe there's a role we could play here from a data provision point of view. We developed a pilot with 10 schools in 2021. Then we expanded it. We put that data out. I mean, it was nothing. We actually got data from 9 schools. It was like a tiny little pilot, but we put that out in 2022. Then 2023, we expanded to 63 colleges. So we had all the states in our district except for North Carolina. And then this year we added North Carolina. 2025, we will add additional states outside of the 5th district. So we'll be announcing those soon, but we'll be adding several whole states next year, and then a few partial states as well, which is really exciting for us. So our goal is to take this beyond our district. As you can imagine, those of you who have collected community college data before, this is really complicated, especially on the non-credit side, because there are a couple states that we're moving into who essentially collect very little non-credit data. There are a couple of others that have really good non-credit data. So there's going to be a pretty extreme range on the non-credit side, but I'll come back to it in a second why we still decided to collect it. So I already covered this, but this is what we decided to collect. We can disaggregate our data by we disaggregate by gender first, and then by race, gender, Pell status, and age, and create a success rate for those students. We also, on the non-credit side, can disaggregate by gender, race, ethnicity, and age. And for most of the colleges, for almost all the colleges in our district right now, we are able to do that pretty successfully. Probably the hardest one to do is age. I mean, sorry, race, but gender and age we're able to do really successfully as of right now. So why did we bother to do this? By the way, when we first started this process and we went out and talked to other researchers, other research organizations, many people said, do not try to do it. Like, don't touch the non-credit side. It's so messy. Now, do recognize this is 5 years ago when we were first having these questions. having these conversations. And one of the things we have seen as we have gone through this over the last 5 years, that the quality is getting much better every year. It is getting better and better. States do recognize, colleges do recognize the need to collect better data. But we decided to go ahead and move forward. And as we say on our team all the time, not let perfect be the enemy of good, for the following reasons. The number one reason is that there are huge amounts of students consuming non-credit programs. There are large numbers of people all across the country that are consuming this education, and we know very little about them compared to students that are consuming other parts of higher ed. Additionally, oftentimes these students get left out of the conversation, right? So when we're looking at, when we look at National Student Clearinghouse data that comes out, say, okay, what happened with fall enrollment last year? That's not even touching these non-credit students, right? And so it's hard to get the overall picture of kind of what's going on at the community college level or in higher ed in general with these students being left out. But also, in addition, the other main reason that we wanted to collect the data is that regularly on a weekly, if not daily basis, we are having conversations with colleges, which, by the way, we have 121 in our district. We've been to over 70 of them in person. We've been on the ground at these schools, and we are told regularly. Just yesterday, I talked to a president who said, we are up in enrollment, but it's only in 2 spaces. It's in dual enrollment and non-credit. And this is something we hear time and time again. And if you do look at even the credit side of four-year colleges and community colleges, it's really those non-degree certificate programs that are growing the most rapidly and that are really seeing any meaningful growth. And I think this does come from this conversation about kind of the questioning of a four-year degree, what is the ROI? And so I think you are seeing student demand shift more towards non-degree pathways, which I don't think we have the data to really know. I mean, some people like Michelle, and I saw Mark on here too, have done excellent work, right? You guys at Rutgers have done a ton of great work in this space, but still the data are limited in a way to where it's very difficult to I think, have a great grasp for if this is actually what we could view as a positive trend or not, right? The causality of some of these relationships is difficult to kind of tease out. We also have seen, though, in our outreach to these schools that these skilled trades and the non-credit programs are increasingly technical, right? These are increasingly skilled, and these skilled trades that require great investment. And in most states, non-credit is underfunded compared to the credit side of the house and in really significant ways. But the programs might be even more expensive in a lot of ways, right? So I joke sometimes, but it's true, as an economist, I just need this marker to teach my class and a whiteboard. I don't need very much, right? But you go in and look at Stephanie, I was jealous. She recently got to do virtual reality welding at a short-term welding program shop. And she told about how incredible it is, but it was of extreme expense, right, to put this into place. We regularly talk to schools that have waiting lists for their CDL programs, but obviously the cost of a tractor trailer is very expensive, right? And so we believe it's important to start talking about this as well, because the funding models do not recognize the shift in demand to these programs or the cost of executing them. And then also in our data, which I'm going to show you, we can see pretty clearly, and we feel pretty confident saying that there are certain demographics that seem to be especially attracted to non-degree programs, and that is notably men and older students, so adult learners. And these are two, I've been in higher ed total. I was at a 4-year institution for 13 years. So I've been in higher ed or researching higher ed for a long, long time. And these are two groups that we've been talking about for decades on how to engage them, right? How do we engage the adult learner? How do we engage male students? And some of the answer to that, I think, is likely in the non-credit space, leaning into that a bit more. So learning more about why some of these groups are demanding non-credit higher levels, and why a 4-year program may not be as attractive to certain groups of students, I think, is especially important. So we recognize that it's messy. We recognize that the data, we can't do with the data what we can do with the data on the credit side. We wish we could like create a success rate on the non-credit side as well. We can't do that yet, but we are looking at ways to link what we have to some workforce, outcomes data, income data, and some other tools that we think will allow us to tell a richer story over time. And we also believe that it's a story worth telling and talking about even in its messiness. So we remain pretty firm on that. Here's the other reason that we feel really passionate about this. This is the North Carolina map for their community college service area. Some of you will be familiar. So I'm sitting in Charlotte right now, and there's 58 community colleges in North Carolina. So second, one of the biggest systems in the country. And, as we go around North Carolina, but other parts of our district as well, one of the things that we hear very frequently is that these employers that are coming in, right? North Carolina has had a ton of economic development, and these employers that are coming in, they want to stand up programs very quickly, right? If you're familiar with the economic development that North Carolina has had recently, much of it is in the electric vehicle space. So you've got these employers that are coming in, and they're like, we need thousands of electric vehicle battery technicians, right? Well, they've got to stand up those programs pretty quickly to scale and get the number of people they need trained. It's very difficult to do that on the credit side of the house, right? It's for those of us on this call that have ever tried to do that. I have put new programs into universities and gone through the accreditation and state process to do that. It's extraordinarily time consuming. The non-credit side is much more nimble. They're able to respond more directly to employer and student demand. And so for us, as the Fed with that workforce lens, this is a really important piece of the puzzle for us too, in terms of how do you serve the labor force? How do you get people the skills they need to get the jobs that they want and the jobs that are available in their communities? And because community colleges serve certain service areas, this looks different everywhere, right? If you put an EV battery technician program in the far eastern part of North Carolina, that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, right? Because those jobs are coming to more central North Carolina. But thinking about how these service areas serve their unique students is important. And honestly, just funding, like I mentioned, in the non-credit space hasn't kept up with this either. So one of the things that we had to spend a lot of time on, of course, is how we define an award-seeking non-credit student, and how do we define like what awards we want to count and what awards we don't want to count. We look at, on the non-credit side, in terms of looking at enrollment, we look at the number of students that are enrolled in non-credit workforce-focused programs that can lead to an award, so that can lead to an industry or employer-recognized credential or licensure, regardless of whether or not they complete the award. We wish we knew whether everybody completed the award, but we don't have those data because of third-party credentialing issues. Now, we are going to add a state next year that thinks they do have that data. So this is going to be interesting as we expand. We may get access to some data that will be quite different in different states. Right now, like Maryland has way better data than Virginia, which has better data than West Virginia, right? There's like this hierarchy kind of in terms of the non-credit data that exists. But we may be able to get access to some of this in other states. So we exclude all the students who are taking any credit-bearing courses. We include them as credit students. But like I mentioned before, if those credit students do get a non-credit award, we do count that as a success for them. So we don't want to double count students. So that's how we keep from doing that. And then what counts as an award is, like I mentioned, something that is an academic or occupational vocational program of study that results in an industry or employer recognized credential or licensure. So we try to set a pretty strict definition here. This is really hard, right? Because the schools want to count everything. So we actually do have a column where they also can tell us about everybody else. Because we get questions. I mean, we literally got a question from one institution last year on whether or not they could count bloodhounds that were trained in their bloodhound training program. No, we're not going to count that, right? I understand that this is a highly skilled animal, and now a person's going to work with it, and that is a job. Got it, get it, but we can't count that in our count, right? Same thing goes with things like ESL certificates or CPR. Like, we don't count those. We explicitly exclude those, or lifestyle things. Now, we've had interesting conversations there because we fully recognize that somebody could go get a cake decorating do a cake decorating class and then go out and be an entrepreneur and start a cake decorating business, right? That can happen. But we have to kind of set a line somewhere, and that's where we've chosen to set it. So we do let them report everybody else because we have found that makes them just feel much more satisfied to be able to kind of provide the full picture of who they're serving. And that's important too. All those lifestyle things, the anchor institution role in terms of like providing services to the community that these community colleges play is really important. And the kind of the continuing ed side of that is important too. So let me show you some results. I'll go through this quickly so we can have time for conversation. So we collected this data last year, 121 schools. The enrollment and outcomes data are from the 2022-2023 academic year, and the success rates, I will show you those really quickly. Those are on the credit side. Those are from the 2019-20 academic year cohort, which is interesting because that is when COVID hit, right? So the students that enrolled in spring are maybe really sensitive there. Okay, so these are our success rates, and I just want to pause here for a second to discuss how much policy appears. We're gonna one day have a beautiful panel data set that we can do more research on, and people like you guys can do more research on. But it does appear that policy really matters in terms of not necessarily the absolute success rate. As you can see, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, their success rates are not wildly different, but the ways in which students are succeeding are different. And that is partially driven by policy. So South Carolina, for example, you can see they have a very large population of students that are transferring without an award. Well, in South Carolina, the largest bridge program, so there's a very large bridge program that goes from Tri-County Technical College to Clemson, and then a very large program that goes from Midlands Tech to University of South Carolina. Those are 1+3 programs. So in most states, their transfer programs tend to be 2+2, kind of the official bridge program. South Carolina has taken a different tack there. And so they're 1+3 programs. So, the students that, and Tri-County Tech has 1,200 to 1,500, I think now, students each year that are doing that program. And so if those students are successful, by definition, they're leaving with nothing from Tri-County Tech. So they show up as a success in our rate, but in the IPEDS rate or in like retention rates, they show up as failures. You can see in West Virginia, they have our highest rate of associate degree attainment, but they have very low transfer rates. Well, in West Virginia, almost all the four-year institutions, public institutions, issue associate degrees. In addition, the gap between how much it costs to go to a community college and how much it costs to go to a four-year school in West Virginia is much narrower than in the other states. And West Virginia four-year institutions all have admissions rates that are over 90%. Some of them are over 98%. So this might take away the incentive, right, of people to, some of this is policy decisions, but some of it also is just, why would you attend a community college to transfer if you could go directly to the four-year school that you would like to attend, right? There are less students who might do that. So it really does depend on kind of state policy and state I would say the environment, the ecosystem in the higher ed of the state, kind of how students are succeeding. But that's one of the things we really like about our measure, because this allows states to serve their students differently, which might be wholly appropriate, right? There might be things about employers. In West Virginia, for example, there are fewer jobs that require a bachelor's degree, so it might make sense for them to issue more associate degrees. We can talk more about that later if you guys want to. On the non-credit side, we did observe 142,353 students across the 5 states seeking workforce recognized awards and credentials. And community colleges reported almost 50 million contact hours, attempted by these students. So you can see that there are some students, like some colleges, like I said, that can. So we had 45 colleges that can report like actually program completion. So this is a limited number, right? We do not have, let's say Maryland is able to do that for all of their schools, but for some of the other states, they're not able to do that quite yet. They have who are in the programs, but they don't necessarily know if they completed. And then we have some colleges, like I mentioned, that are able to see the licensures and certificates that are awarded based off of that. But we do also see, this gets back to policy. We feel pretty confident after collecting these data for 3 years in saying that the policy around non-credit matters. If you, in terms of funding, if you look here, and obviously we have 5 states, so this is going to look different next year when we're able to add some more. But so take it for what it's worth. But Maryland, North Carolina, and South Carolina all fund non-credit through the funding formulas. So there are appropriated dollars that are provided to schools for non-credit programs. Maryland funds credit and non-credit at par, so same FTE dollar level. North Carolina, some are at par, some programs are not. South Carolina is not at par, but South Carolina has also, in addition to those appropriated dollars, thrown major money at non-credit in terms of scholarship dollars. So the governor has really made this one of his standout issues while he's been governor. And South Carolina, quite frankly, has had a lot of extra tax revenue the past few years because the growth that has been seen in the state, and they have put much of it a good bit of it towards non-credit scholarships through what's called the WINS program. Virginia and West Virginia are different. So Virginia does not fund non-credit through appropriations. They do have what's called the Fast Forward program, but this is more of it's kind of a partial scholarship program, partial funding to the institution, and programs must qualify to be a Fast Forward program. And this is a relatively high bar in terms of what you have to do to get your program to qualify. And so we even see within Virginia, you might have equivalent exact same programs where at one community college they're Fast Forward and one they're not because they haven't submitted the paperwork to get it approved. And West Virginia does not fund non-credit through, they see it more as a individual profit center. So we see major differences in the share of non-credit enrollment as a percent of total credit seeking enrollment, but also we see big differences if you look at non-credit enrollment in the 3 states that do fund via appropriations as a percent of the population. Like if you norm it to how big the states are, there are massive differences there too. So we do feel like, as I mentioned before, there's kind of this misalignment of incentives in many states, right? Where if you're not getting dollars for these programs, you might choose to either not have them or maybe put them on something on the credit side that would make more sense to be the non-credit side. And that's a conversation we've had with a lot of presidents kind of offline about those decisions that they make. That being said, even within states, so this is within West Virginia, there are large differences across schools. So like I mentioned, you might even have certain programs at one school where they're only available on the credit side, one school where they're only available on the non-credit side, and another school where they're available actually on both sides. So something like farm tech, for example. And a lot of this we have found is really based on individual college leadership within the institution and the leadership on the non-credit community continuing education side, because even in places like Maryland, in Maryland, the school with the smallest non-credit program is still 10% of their overall enrollment, but there's one that's almost 60%, right? So the levels are higher, but there's still considerable variation. Now, once again, this might be very appropriate depending on the service areas that these individual schools are serving. I think as an economist, if I saw these all the way across, I would think that probably would be inappropriate, right? These places are very different. If you go to some of these community colleges in Maryland are in areas where a very high percentage of jobs in the area relative to the rest of the country require a bachelor's degree or higher, right? So these shorter term non-degree credentials might not have the same ROI as they would in a place that was more manufacturing heavy, for example, more rural, potentially where a lower percentage of jobs require a degree in the area. I mentioned this before, but we definitely see that there is more male enrollment on the non-credit side as a percent. All 5 states, the non-credit side is dominated by men. And that is a little bit interesting because oftentimes on the non-credit side, you do see a lot of healthcare programs. Those do tend to be female dominated, but the other programs are just heavily male dominated. I want to point out that we have this unknown category. Remember, I said we can observe most of the gender, most of the age. There still are some schools that don't collect as much data on non-credit, even basic data. When we first started this 5 years ago, there were some schools that basically had nothing. We're going to add a state next year where it's still like that. So it can be extraordinarily challenging in some states, as I know Michelle and Mark and some of their work have pointed out. But as I mentioned, even in the places where the data collection is lacking, it is improving. All of them know this is something they need to be moving towards. In North Carolina, there are some institutions, you can see there are 4 institutions on the far left there, where more than half of their male students are enrolled on the non-credit side. So, and there are many where it's over 30%. So that male enrollment is really, we think, and we have seen at the schools that we have been observing over time that has been increasing. And the same thing with older students. So once again, there's some students we can't observe their age, but we can observe most of it. We can, and this is why these data are not perfect. We're not going to be able to disaggregate them like we would wish to right now. Hopefully one day we can, but right now we really can't by school. But in aggregate, these data are still good, and we see but we can see that over 70%, I think it's like 72.5% of the non-credit students who are working towards workforce recognized or industry recognized credentials are over age 25. So final thoughts, like I said, non-credit data are messy, but are getting better. Our estimates should absolutely be considered a lower bound because we know we're not observing everything. We will put tons of asterisks around this stuff for many years as we put it out, and we'll start putting more of it out next year as we roll out of pilot mode. But we feel very strongly that ignoring these non-credit programs and not collecting the data, even in its messiness, is more dangerous than, or not collecting is more dangerous than collecting and putting out in its messiness. And part of that is because of the cost of administering these programs. And oftentimes, I mean, you guys know this, when you talk to people and they talk to you about what they think of as programs at community colleges, oftentimes they are talking about things that are on the non-credit side, right? They'll talk about things like CDL or welding credentials or things like that either are or could be on the non-credit side. And we believe that this alignment of incentives is extremely important, right? You have to think about not only the employer's incentives of wanting to have quality employees that have certain skills, but also what is the student's incentives to go gain those skills, and what is the institution's incentive to offer the programs that provide those skills. And getting in that sweet spot in the middle is very difficult, but moving towards it is a goal I think that would make sense from an economic standpoint. In terms of what's next for us, we are going to expand outside of our district this year. We actually, I think today, our website, which I have a QR code for a second, went live with the North Carolina data. We got the North Carolina data later than the other states, so we just went live with that. And we are providing every college in our survey an individualized report so they can see their data and how they measure up to other colleges in the state and in the district. We'll continue writing about this 2024 data and putting it out this year. And then next year, this year we're doing, like I said, adding some states, continuing to do the project pretty much in the way we've done. We're making some improvements, of course, but kind of in the same way we did it last year. But next year, we're really excited. In January, we'll release a dashboard and downloadable data that will allow people to see our data in very different ways, and it will allow colleges to also create peer groups across the schools that are in our district or in our data set, so that schools that, oftentimes there might be a place like Maryland where there's just like 1 or 2 schools that are really rural, they'll be able to compare themselves to rural schools in other states. So I'll kind of stop here with these QR codes we have on the left. This is our survey results page where you can see the results we put out this year. And on the right, you can subscribe to our Community College Insights blog. This is where we'll continue to produce content and write. I think we have a piece coming out early next week about the success rates this year, but we'll continue to write and put pieces out, not only about our survey, we're writing about other community college related things too. So about funding models, about non-credit, about all sorts of different things that come up in the kind of the community college policy space. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Laura. This was all very interesting. I do think that we can go ahead and take a few questions from the audience that have shown up in the chat. Yes, Stroll, you asked a couple questions about the overlap between credit and non-credit data and how and kind of what the availability of non-credit. Do you want to say a little bit more?
Well, yeah, I saw that there was that Laura had put an exclusion that that credit people aren't looked at to see if they have non-credit, and I was wondering what kind of bias that introduced, knowing North Carolina, which historically I think was a traditionally non-credit state. How do they deal with credit? I'm just wondering if you have a sense of what you're missing. And the other question, which I probably know the answer to, is there any chance that any of these states have historic data on the non-credit, or what we have to be looking for is the future development of these data systems?
So on the first side, we do collect data on the enrollment side on how many of the credit students are taking non-credit classes, if they can provide us that. There are some states that aren't quite there. We do have that, but we don't want to, when we're doing, especially because we're doing our success metric, we don't want to double count people. So we have to kind of classify them as a non-credit student or a credit student. And so the way we've done that is we're saying if students are taking classes for credit, we count them on the credit side. If they're fully just taking non-credit, we count them on the non-credit side. This is going to get interesting as more schools, we don't have a lot that are doing this yet, but the lines are starting to blur, which by the way, we think is a good thing, where there are more schools that are considering like credit for non-credit courses, right? And so it's going to get a little bit complicated, but the states are figuring out how to handle that too. So we'll work with them as they do it. So we're not too worried about like missing out on anybody.
Well, it wasn't about missing out on anybody. It's about understanding whether or not these are complements or substitutes. So are people using them together? Because I think we're breaking our old linear
Yes.
model of education. So just your
Yeah.
pipeline alone, people aren't necessarily following that in the linearity that you presented.
Correct.
And so the
Correct.
next question is, are people using non-credit, let's say in a skill builders framework? So you get a dislocated worker. Are
Yeah.
they touching the system and picking up non-credit on top of a degree in
Yeah.
combination with
Very
credit?
little.
And
So yeah, we
okay, so
see
very
very
little.
little
So
of
it's
that.
one, it
Very
is
little.
one or the other from what you've seen. Okay.
Yeah, for the almost, now, once again, I'm not gonna claim that we have full data on
That's
that,
fine. Don't worry about that. No,
yeah,
no.
very little right now. I that may change over time, right? I suspect. I think I think if many of the people on this call were building out like a perfect model, it would change, right? In terms of like how people consume education. It will be interesting to see how that changes. I think there's a lot of talk of it changing. But right now we see, I mean, honestly, Jeff, like most of our states, with the exception of one, still have completely different data, I'm pausing before I say one. It might be two now because we've had some change, but I think it's still just one where the non-credit data are collected in a completely separate system. So if you were a credit student, you would have to like officially even re-enroll in the non-credit side to take a non-credit program. So they're very separate in terms of the administration of the programs and kind of how the registration and data collection works. So it is not a smooth process. The second part of what was the second question?
Oh, no, it was more about just if there are any of these states demonstrating historic archives of data that yet to be released, or are we
No.
just looking? No, okay, that's what I thought. All right, thank you.
However, one state, I'm not gonna say what state yet, but we're gonna announce them very soon. But one state we're gonna add next year has an archive of data. So we're gonna do some trials with them. We're gonna do kind of a little pilot with them. Maryland by far has the best quality non-credit data in our system, and that is because they are collecting data in the exact same system, and also they fund at par, and they also allow people to use the Maryland Promise free community college scholarship on the non-credit side. And so so oftentimes we say in our shop, like what gets funded gets measured, what gets measured gets managed, right? Like they're funding it in a different way, so they're also measuring it differently.
Thank you.
Do you see, Kyle, I see a
Jennifer
question
Engel.
here that I want to make sure I clarify that popped up from Robin to say that
Yeah.
in our formula for success rates, I'm going to go back to that really quickly. No, everybody that's in the numerator is in the denominator. So everybody in the denominator, our cohort is full-time and part-time, and everybody that's first time, as long as they're first time at that institution. So it's full and part-time students. And then the numerator is the percent of those students that achieved one of these things. We do break it down by full-time and part-time. So a school can observe, or you can observe, once our dashboard goes live next year, the part-time success rate and the full-time success rate. But in our overall success metric, we combine them. And we chose to do that because they serve so many part-time students, we think they should be included in the overall success rate.
So looking at the messages we have in the chat, I'm thinking you might call on Jennifer and then possibly Mark. See, Catherine also has a kind of a speculative question that we could get to if time permits as well. So Jennifer Engel.
Yeah, sure. Hi, thanks so much for this, Laura. This was a really great presentation and just exciting to see the work that you all are doing in this area. Of course, those of us who love data, we're always going to ask for more. So seeing these grad rates and completion rates was exciting. And so the next question for me was earnings and employment. And
Yes.
if that's on your roadmap, and if you could say a little bit more about that.
It is. It is. We get asked about this all the time, and we would love if we could just snap our fingers and make it happen. But that is way more complicated than that, as you all know. We are working very hard to be able, like, our goal in the long run, and this is why we're doing the wraparound services survey too, because we would love to be able to like observe enrollment, then the wraparound services that are provided, then the success on both the credit and non-credit side. And then what is their income on the other side after that, right? And it would be great to observe their income before they come in the door too, right? So this would be our dream scenario that we would love to build this thing. We are working with different data providers. So we're having conversations with folks like Credlins and Strata and Lightcast and all sorts of other organizations that have access to some of these data and are trying to build their own data products. The other thing that we're doing, Jennifer, is that we're also having a lot of conversations and trying to inform better data sharing amongst agencies, because really that's one of the biggest parts of this issue is that the data exists, they are just not shared adequately. And in some states we have situations where they don't even have SOX codes available, so they can't even observe, right? If somebody's working at a hospital, are they a nurse or are they working as a patient care tech, they can't tell, right? So they have to make these kind of very broad assumptions in terms of what jobs people are in. So we're also working, like I said, this survey is like a part of our work, but we're also trying to work because I actually think this is a good role for the Fed personally, because we have access to people in these agencies and we have that independent lens where we maybe can have some broader conversations about that. But that is absolutely a part of what we want to do. There are also some states, South Carolina just started collecting SOX codes, and they've done some pretty interesting stuff tracking a few non-credit credentials to see what the ROI is. And there's some promising data out there. So we're actually going to have our first in-person convening this November, and we're hoping to have them come in and talk about that process, about what that's been like to do at the South Carolina level. In South Carolina, by the way, that project and that major initiative was taken on because there was a workforce bill passed. So it was policy that forced their hand to finally make it work, right? And so on our team, we often come back to like, what's the policy lever that could improve some of this as well? But yes, we're right there with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one more connection I'll make to that. Obviously, you all, I'm sure, are engaged in the conversations around short-term Pell. And
yes, very much.
That conversation is happening in a data are missing from that conversation because we
Correct.
don't have data on the completion rates, which I think you're helping to fill some of that gap, and then that post-completion earnings. And so to help inform that broader conversation at the federal level,
Absolutely.
This is going to be just really critical.
Absolutely. Mark, I think Kyle, you said Mark next. I saw your question on here, Mark, about the workforce training. So one thing I'm sitting here and thinking as you're asking this very good question. So we do count customized training if it is designed to also be workforce that if it fits our standard and it's on the workforce training side, we want them to count it. But we do not separate it out in our data. And that's something that we probably could and should do to see what percentage, especially in a place like South Carolina, they're doing a lot of this stuff. That would actually be really interesting. So we do ask them to include it, but we do not separate it out.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, and I know we often think about sort of these two types of workforce non-credit, the customized training versus more of the open enrollment. And, even I think to think about those states that maybe have a higher concentration of customized training, if there are any nuanced findings. So yeah, just curious, but maybe something to think about, moving forward.
Yeah, that is something really good to think about, and we're in the process of doing that thinking right now. So that timing on that suggestion is really good too. But yeah, that's definitely something good to think about. Thank you for that.
Great, thanks, Laura.
Could I have a question to follow up on the nuance? I posted in the chat. This is great, Laura. Thank you so much. But I'm wondering, I know what you're displaying here is an aggregation of data from multiple institutions and states, but and it doesn't seem like there's a breakdown of categories of non-credit education or types of licenses awarded or credentials awarded. Do states or institutions themselves collect those types of data? Because I feel like in terms of policy, that would really, directing resources, those would be really important.
So the third-party credential data is very, very difficult to come by, if not impossible. Some states are not even trying. Some states are trying and getting limited numbers. So right now it is not possible. However, we do ask them for some breakdowns in terms of our people, getting a licensure or a certificate, what are they getting? The data is extraordinarily messy right now, but I also believe this is a space, like I mentioned, things are getting better every year. There are some data that we are asking for that, if I'm being really honest, we know we cannot really get right now, but we don't want to not ask for it with an intent to encourage collection of it, or just because, to your point, we absolutely need these data to set good policy, to have the right conversations, in my opinion. And so we want to encourage that process. And so there are times when we think, why do we even have this blank in here? We know we're not getting much, but it is to kind of encourage the continuation of moving forward. Yeah, so it's very limited what we can get right now in terms of the type of credential, because most schools and states have no idea. They know somebody completes a CNA course. Well, some of them don't even know that. But if they know they complete the CNA course, they do not know if they pass the licensing exam or not. That's what Credlins is trying to fill much of that gap. So it may be that we can get, if Credlins can, through Strata, if you're familiar with that product, if they can collect the third-party credential data, it may be that it takes somebody like that doing that effort rather than the schools trying to do it themselves. They're trying to be more of kind of like the National Student Clearinghouse of non-credit. And that may be a great solution. And we will happily use that data when they get it. Because our transfer data, that's coming from National Student Clearinghouse, right? That's where those schools are getting that from. So yeah, I think that may be what we see happen going forward.
Another thought is obviously the N2's National Training Education Workforce Survey that's been conducted by the National Science Foundation.
Yes.
That one does pick up a number of those items on licenses and industry certifications. It's not perfect. It doesn't, get full data on everyone held by everyone in that survey. The survey itself is, weighted towards certain subpopulations that kind of reflect the policy interests of the NSF. But it is it can be weighted in a way that it becomes nationally representative. So if you think about, I'm sure it's possible to, I'm sure it would be possible to come up with a sample that matches
Yeah, that's really good point.
and territory.
Yeah,
So
really
that's
good point.
another thought of another area that might be worth looking at.
Yeah, that's great.
Another potential data source. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think this kind of speaks to Catherine's comment as well. Catherine, if you're still here, feel welcome to jump in.
Yeah, Laura, this is really great. Thank you so much for presenting it. I work with the Burning Glass Institute, and we were working with JFF and relaunched EQUOS, and so have career history data and have identified folks who have reported that they have earned a non-degree credential. Of course, we don't have the enrollment and the completion data. So sort of the other side, and in our data set, we actually see that the community college representation of non-degree credentials has a much lower representation than the third-party providers. So yeah, really interesting. Of course, like I said, it's self-reported, so none of this data is perfect yet, but I'm really excited to see everybody working on it to try to find the right solution, so we can find the right policies to support workers and educators.
That's great. Thank you so much for that comment.
So it's 1:57. If there's no final thoughts, I think we can conclude with a big thank you to our speaker, Laura. Really appreciate everything here today. Very fascinating. It's definitely a data source that many of us will check out and take a closer look at. So really appreciate it. We hope you can join us at the NCRN's spring conference, which again is going to be on the 28th of May. Everyone on this, I hope everybody on this call will make it there, and we'll be meeting again in Washington, D.C. That will be an in-person event. There's been information sent out to our mailing list, and if you're not on our email list, you can join through the website or send an email to myself or Michelle, and we'll make sure you're added. I don't know if Michelle or anybody else on the Rutgers team has any final announcements. If not, thanks again. We really appreciate it, and we'll see everyone again next month.
Thanks so much.
A couple links I think Michelle just put in the chat there about the registration. So thank you all.